Welcome to episode 449 of the Reformed Brotherhood. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Tony, and I don't know what I'm going to say here. Hold on. I didn't even think of a tagline.
That's okay.
This is the podcast that doesn't edit anything out, as you are hearing right now.
Oh, that all went in.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. It's all there. Hey, brother.
Hey, brother. Well, there you go, everybody. That's a full peek behind the curtain. The audio equivalent of seeing everything that's in the closet you just heard.
Yeah. You're also probably hearing a motorcycle driving by in the backyard. I'm podcasting outdoors tonight. We're going to try this and see if it works a little better with two kids trying to sleep in a very small house. So you might hear some background noise. You might hear some birds. You might hear my neighbor yelling for me to shut up or something, but I think it'll be okay. I think it'll be good.
Live from Lebanon, New Hampshire. Here's the good thing about you being outside is you're almost not more than let's say like a very strong stone's throw away from a rather large Mormon church. So it's good for them to hear that true gospel being proclaimed outside, if it's only one half of a conversation.
It's true. I don't know that they do much on a Saturday night. I don't really know what their schedule is.
Doesn't matter. You're there just in case.
It's true. I'll just have to shout really loud.
Make it happen. I love that.
Yeah.
We are talking about the Sabbath on this episode. So
that's true.
A little bit of Sabbath, and we'll just see where it goes. We got a long back catalog of Sabbath talking, but it never hurts to come back to something that's good to rehearse and good to re-understand over and over and over again. So we'll get there, but I think you should proclaim to your neighbors either something that you're affirming with or denying against. In this case, you can proclaim it from the rooftop to all the people that live nearby to you. True. What do you got for us on this episode?
I'm not podcasting from the rooftop, but maybe that's an experiment for next time. I'm affirming a book. It came out a while ago, so I tend to be a little bit late to the game on book affirmations, mostly because I'm slow at getting to new books because I've got a big backlog and I don't have a ton of reading time. But I also like, even when I have kind of started a book right when it comes out or I'm sort of quick off the line, I like to wait a little while because, sometimes books make the podcast rounds and you hear 100 people talk about the same book right when it comes out. And I like to maybe be a little bit behind that and sometimes give the book a second run or sort of maybe a little bit of a boost if it's a good recommendation. So I'm plugging my way through a book called Reformed Covenant Theology by Harrison Perkins. Harrison is, he's probably most well known for blogging at the Heidelcat blog. He does a lot of work on that blog. And this book is just so crisp and clear and good. So it's not anything groundbreaking. He's not advancing some new theory of covenant theology. It's just good, plain vanilla Reformed covenant theology. But it does go a little bit deeper than you might encounter in a sort of treatment of covenant theology that is embedded within something else. A lot of times when you're reading a systematic theology book, there'll be a chapter or a couple chapters on covenant theology, or maybe you'll have sort of a part of the prolegomena. We'll talk about how covenant is sort of the architectonic structure of systematic theology. So it's not itself a loci of systematic theology. What Perkins really is trying to do in this book is he's really trying to do a thorough systematic theology, fully incorporating covenant theology as not only the subject of the book, but also the structure of the book. And so what you find is he's approaching topics like divine simplicity and the unity of God and the inseparable operations. He's approaching those topics with the covenant in mind. And so the chapter on the covenant of redemption, for example, has a long discussion about how not only does the covenant of redemption not contradict divine simplicity, which is a common criticism, but it actually is necessary. Divine simplicity is necessary for the covenant of redemption to function the way that we believe it does. He pulls out some cool distinctions, in covenant thought that you wouldn't encounter other places. So he pulls out the distinction between, I think it's ex promisor and fiduciae. And so an ex promisor surety is basically someone who assumes the debt, versus a fiduciae, which would be someone who is assuming responsibility for the debt or is promising to pay the debt. So, for example, if I had If I had a $100,000 debt and Jesse went to the bank and signed the entire debt over to his name, he hasn't paid the debt off yet, but I'm no longer liable for it. That's the ex-promisor model. The fiduciary model would be if Jesse says to me, I promise you that I'm going to pay the debt, just send me the bills when they come in. That would be the fiduciary model. And so he points out that the ex-promisor model is what Christ does in the covenant of redemption, and that is enacted in the covenant of grace. So that solves some problems in terms of, or some sticky things in terms of how covenant theology works. So it's well worth your read. It's super well written. It's approachable, but it's in-depth and technical in all the right ways, but it's approachable in all the right ways as well. And he's not like he's a super winsome writer. He's not like, it's not polemical. Other than, positing one position is necessarily positing the contrary to positions that are contradictory to it. So he's undercutting under positions by advocating this. And when appropriate, he will sort of make a comment about how something in the Bible, excludes dispensationalism or whatever it might be. But he's not. It's not a battle cry kind of book. You're not gonna find a lot of like railing against other systems. It's really just a good exercise in sort of positive, constructive theology of descriptive theology. It's well worth your read. It's well worth the money. It's available on Logos. It's also available in hard print. It was published by Lexham Press, which is Logos's publishing house. So it's well done. It's well put together. Can't recommend it enough. Just go purchase it, read it, digest it, read it again, metabolize it. It's really good.
It's always good to have something in the mix that's, as you said, equal parts accessible in terms of its technical components, but just the fact that it's also practical theology for you to process, understand. And sounds like the kind of work that no matter who you are, you're going to find a little piece of that, at least that's over your head, as we often say. And that's good. Reading that stuff, reading up, looking up, trying to understand up with our reliance on the Holy Spirit to enlighten our minds. Always a good exercise. Sounds like this book is par for that course.
Yeah. I think it'll be helpful for anybody who wants to understand covenant theology, whether you already hold to covenant theology and you want to understand it deeper, or whether you might be someone who is exploring it and aren't quite sure, or someone who's kind of a hostile witness and just wants to make sure you have a good understanding of this theology that you're trying to refute. Because it takes kind of he's obviously advocating for covenant theology. He's building an argument, but because it's not polemical, it's not going to rub you in any particular way. Whether you're, if you're opposed to covenant theology, it's not going to rub against your sensibilities. It's all very straightforward, very biblical, very well sourced, very well cited biblically. He's very deeply connected to all the confessional standards, particularly the Westminster. I think Harrison is an OPC minister. So he's partial, obviously, to the Westminster, but he makes use of the Heidelberg. He's referring to, classic covenant theology sources like Witzius and Voss and Bavinck. So check it out. Covenant Reformed Theology. It's available by Lexham Press. Go get it. It's worth it. It's worth your time. It's worth your money.
You know what else people should go do is they should go and watch this episode online at YouTube, because right now your camera angle, your background actually looks fake. It's that good. It's got that kind of vibe to it. I mean, you can see it, right? Could you also see that as being just a fake background?
Yeah, it looks a little bit like a virtual background. It's not to watch. See, I'll do this and it changes. See? So like that would be, I suppose that's probably not impossible to do with a virtual background, but it'd be pretty tough. Yeah,
it could just all be AI.
The whole thing is AI. This podcast isn't even happening.
Long ago, we actually stopped doing this, like in the 100s. Like we were pioneering AI before you even knew about ChatGPT or.
Yeah, the last episode was the one we recommended ChatGPT. After that, it's been all AI from there. That's true. Jesse, what are you affirming or denying tonight?
I'm going to keep it light. I'm also going with the affirmation. You get to an age where you start to realize you've had some things that have been with you for quite some time. And I was just thinking the other day that there's a couple of things in my life that I really love. It's like having good friends who've been with you for some time. And some of those friends for me are guitars, I've realized. And so I was just thinking the other day, because it's VBS time of year and getting all the different special VBS equipment together. And I've had the privilege of owning, and more often than not playing and not owning because they're more expensive than I can afford, like nice guitars like Gibson, PRS, Ibanez, like Gretsch, Epiphone, Yamaha, Rickenbacker, like amazing guitars. But I found that 4 of the guitars I own are all Fenders, and I love them dearly, and they're just fantastic. And they're not really that expensive as far as guitars go, but my 2 favorites are, I have a Stratocaster, custom Stratocaster, and I have a Telecaster. And they're just so much fun, But the great thing about them is they're just like workhorses. Like they're almost utilitarian. The Stratocaster is the one that I play for on the Lord's Day. Often I will use that at VBS as well. And here's why. Because I never worry about this thing. Like we could take it outside right now in my driveway, run over it twice.
Oh yeah.
It would still be in tune. It'd be totally fine. And at like Vacation Bible School, there's going to be a rogue child. I mean, you all know what I'm talking about. If you've been to any of those, and that child is going to inadvertently knock over everything. And I never worry about it. So I'm affirming with Fender guitars. They're fantastic guitars. If you have a loved one in your life that wants to learn how to play guitar, acoustic or electric, a Fender is a great guitar because it's good for a beginner. You can grow into it. They sound beautiful. And the acoustic one I have is like aging really well. Like it sounds better all the time. Just the wood aging and becoming more soft and resonant and clear and crisp in its tone. So there you go. Fender guitars. I think they're just fantastic instruments.
Yeah. I was at summer camp one time, and the sort of surprise the kids skit was the person who was leading musical worship was playing a Stratocaster electric guitar, right? So it's basically like a solid block of something. I'm not sure what it's made out of. It's made out of the same thing that those Nokia phones are that never break. And he was supposed to smash his guitar on the picnic table as part of the skit. So he was supposed to take his guitar, smash it on the picnic table. It was an old Stratocaster. Everybody was fully expecting the thing to just shatter. Yeah. And he slammed it and it went through the picnic table, like through the top of the picnic table.
Surprise. Yeah.
And was totally, I mean, it was scratched, but like the hardware, the body of it was totally fine. I was a little surprised that the neck was okay because the neck is just a regular guitar neck, but it was pretty funny, and it was funny because we didn't know what to do with the skit from there, because the whole thing was he was supposed to smash his guitar on the picnic table and then like storm out. He smashed through the picnic table, and everyone was like, "What do we do now? Like, what's the skit now supposed to be?"
That's tough. That turns into improv at that point because you have like somebody with their figurative axe literally chopping a picnic table in two.
Yeah. No, Stratocasters are solid guitars in both figuratively and in the literal sense. I have an Ibanez that I really like. The action's a little high. But I got that when I was in like I was still in community college, so I was younger than 22, younger than 22. So I've had that guitar now for longer than half of my life at this point. Which is crazy. Fantastic. And I have not taken good care of that guitar, to be honest with you. And it's still in basically perfect shape.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's a good
I think
guitar.
the neck is probably a little bit bent. It could probably use a little bit of work. But I mean, if you are a guitar player or if you're wanting to learn to play guitar, probably don't buy a nice guitar right out of the gate because you're going to beat it up. You're going to break it. It's just going to get beat on as you move it around and take it to lessons and, whatever. But a good guitar that is going to be well made is worth the investment. For example, most good guitar brands like an Ibanez or a Gibson or Fender, even something like an Ovation, which is a little bit less expensive of a guitar, or at least on the lower end of the guitar range, most of those come with lifetime warranties for hardware and stuff. So a good guitar investment is really, really worth your time if you're going to be serious about playing guitar, using it for helping to lead musical worship. It's a good investment. Pass it down to your kids or to your family. So yeah, that's a great affirmation. I only currently I have a couple guitars, but I only have one that's really playable. I think my favorite guitar is my dad's guitar from when he was, my age and younger, playing in bands, which right now is just sort of hanging out in a closet somewhere. When we get a different house that's not so low and I can get it up off the ground a little bit more where the kids can't reach it, I plan on mounting it on the wall. Actually, as more of like an art piece. Yeah. So that's a great affirmation. You've got some nice guitars. That acoustic guitar that you used to keep up here at the church was always nice to see, and it sounded great. So
listen, you and I have talked about this. There's a couple of things in life that I think we'll always say more is better. And generally for me, that's books and guitars. The guitar is much to my wife's chagrin. So where I'm holding steady at like 13 right now, and they're just packed everywhere. They're under beds, in closets. Like you can't go anywhere in our place. We live in a pretty, I would say modest like townhouse. So there's not a ton of storage, but in just anywhere you go, you open up a random closet, there's going to be like a guitar right in your face. So I'm always trying to sneak sneak more in because they're beautiful. By the way, as a quick aside, one of the things that always gets me, and your story got me like in the feels and the gut, is even if it's like some kind of scene where I know it's fake, when I see anybody smash an instrument, it just hits me like in the
Yeah.
feels. It really does bother me, even when I know it's totally manufactured. There's just something about it. But all the more so when I see musicians actually destroy equipment,
Yeah.
it really does get me. I dislike that so much.
Yeah. One more funny story involving smashing an instrument, or not smashing an instrument, I
Yes,
suppose.
please hit me again.
I was at, there used to be this music festival in Wilmer, Minnesota called Sunshine. I don't know if they still have it or not. I would be really surprised if they still did. But I would go every summer, and it's your typical Christian music festival, which is way more like a secular music festival. Don't even get me started on DC Talk this week. And
No.
I know I don't want to catch them all anymore.
Yeah. I thought
And
about you when I heard that news. Just can we just say real quick?
yeah,
It was tragic, and we don't have to get into it. But you were like the second person in my mind.
I immediately was like, "Ooh, I was in the airport with that dude."
Yep.
Anyway, we're not going to go there. Maybe we will on some future episode, but probably not. I was at Sunshine, and it was Pigeon John. Do you remember Pigeon John?
Yeah, for sure.
It was a Pigeon John concert, and I
Yeah.
don't know why Pigeon John was playing an acoustic guitar, but he was playing an acoustic guitar for one of his songs. And at the end of the set, he thought it would be a good idea. I could tell this wasn't scripted because you could see like his like staff and like his I don't know, bodyguard, I don't know, like security personnel. You could see them freak out when it happened. He took the guitar, he threw it straight up in the air and stood there, and the guitar came down directly on top of his head.
Oh wow!
And it was a cheap acoustic guitar. It just like folded. I mean, it was practically paper, which is probably good, because if it had been a Stratocaster, then that would have been his last concert. He'd be eating. He'd probably be dead, but he'd be eating through a straw most of the rest of his life. But yeah, it just like shattered all over the place, like disintegrated. It must have been made out of like balsam wood or something like that. But yeah, don't throw your guitars in there. Don't smash guitars. There's no reason. There's no reason to do that.
No, I mean, I know
it's
people
not
are
cool.
Say,
it never was, but it
right.
definitely isn't anymore. Just don't do it.
Yeah, people will say they were old, it was for effect, or even when I see it in like music videos, it's not simulated destruction of instruments. Right. I know it. You're actually beating some up. So I actually will lose respect for bands if I see that happen. It's just hard because I just will say somebody could have used that. A beginner, somebody would love to play that. Why? There's got to be another way. It's also just not that cool. So,
or you just manufactured rage.
Yeah, you might end up destroying your favorite picnic table unawares. Like, just don't.
It was so unreal when it happened. If I remember right, too, the Stratocaster like dug into the ground. It was like it was like a literal axe. It like dug into the ground and like stuck there. I was like, wow, that's something else. That's something.
I'm telling you, it's a serious instrument that takes a licking. And just like yours, mine has been through a lot. When I think of like all the places I've played with these things, like, at campfires, at random church events, on the Lord's Day, at children's events, at retreats, like all over the place. The stories this guitar could tell, like where it's been packed away, what's been spilled on it, all kinds of stuff. How many things have been plugged into, all kinds of sound systems. And that's the beauty of it. If you need two different kinds, sounds, like I have the Telecaster is, let's go slightly nerdy for a second, but is like humbucker pickups. They're more like heavy, beefy, robust kind of pickup. And generally speaking, my church's sound system, which is nothing to, shake a stick at, it's pretty substantial. It can't handle this guitar. Like we've tried several times to mix it in the right way, and we just take people's feelings right out of their mouths. So it's just amazing. Like these instruments are lovely. It's a beautiful thing to have these kinds of things, and all the sounds you can make on them is fantastic. So we could talk all night about music, but I'll tell you what also happens on the Lord's Day for many of us, but not all of us, as we're going to talk about, is a little bit of Sabbath. Yeah. And that's the whole point of our conversation on this episode.
Yeah. So we should preface this. The Sabbath is a perennial topic in Reformed theology. And contrary to what you might think from reading your favorite online Twitter person or being in your favorite online Facebook group, the Reformed world is not totally univocal on this subject. There's not as much variation as some people might want to make it seem. Some people want to make it seem like Calvin had no regard for the Sabbath, or he was like bowling on the Sabbath, which seems anachronistic to me, playing lawn darts or something like that. So there is a fair amount of variety. but there is not so much variety that there's like practically no view of the Sabbath on some. The Reformed tradition has universally held the Sabbath in high regard. It's why all of the Reformed confessional statements or confessions, the major ones, have some sort of statement on the Sabbath, and they're more or less uniform. So we're not covering any sort of new ground. There's not anything super controversial that we're going to talk about tonight, but it bears saying that, it's not necessarily the case that every Reformed thinker in the history of Reformed theology is going to say that if you stop at Walmart to pick up a gallon of milk, that you're somehow violating the Sabbath. And you will run into some corners of the internet that'll make it sound like that's the uniform standard position, and any deviation from that is not Reformed theology. But that said, we do want to also say the Reformed confessional tradition, which is where this show positions itself and where we are, is pretty specific on some of the details we're going to talk about. So this is not anything new. We're not saying anything that we haven't said probably in our previous episodes. I think Jesse totaled it up, was it 6 or 7 different episodes on
At
Sabbath?
least 6.
Yeah, specific Sabbath episodes that we've done, not just like episodes that are somehow related to that, but actually talking about Sabbath as the main topic of the episode. There's been several. This one we want to come at from a little bit of a different angle, or at least add a little bit of flavor text from a comment that came in the Telegram chat, which, by the way, if you're not in the Telegram chat, you go to t.me/Reformed Brotherhood, and you can jump in and join the conversation. You can suggest some topics. Jesse and I are planning on doing kind of what we call grab bag topics, which is just sort of like miscellaneous topics, probably until the end of July, maybe into August sometime. We'll start our next series, which we don't know what that's going to be yet. So if you have an idea for a topic or something you'd like us to cover, go ahead and jump into that Reformed Brotherhood Telegram chat. There's a thread for topics, and just jump in there. So here's the question, or the comment that I wanted to sort of talk about tonight. Our brother Noah said that he recently heard the idea that, quote, rest is fulfilled in Christ and not something set for a specific day. And then he provides a number of passages that I think are intended to prove that point. And it says, therefore, the argument is that there is no biblical basis for us to rest on the Lord's day as it is fulfilled in our new relationship with Christ. Rest, being reconciled with God, not something for a specific day. Rest is ongoing, but so is work. We were made for work. The rest spoken in the Bible is one for us to find in salvation in Christ, not in a day of rest. So essentially, the question or the topic is, there are those out there who would argue that the Sabbath is no longer a specific day. It was in the Old Covenant. And now that and this is particularly prominent in what's called New Covenant theology, which is not really a covenant theology. It's really sort of a form of like covenantal dispensationalism a lot of time. Maybe that's a little bit bombastic, but it doesn't really share affinity with classic Reformed covenant theology, but it's called New Covenant theology. And so the idea is that in the Old Covenant, there was a set aside day that looked forward and pointed to the coming of Christ. And now that Christ has come, those regulations, those requirements to rest on a particular day of the week, 1 in 7, are no longer in effect. So that's part of what we want to talk about, but we've covered that before. And so there was an interesting comment that came in kind of as a response to that I think we want to at least tread carefully. And I think we'll be able to explain why. It says, in some parts of the world where Christians meet in secret and Sunday is a work day for everyone, Friday becomes the day of rest and worship. I don't think we can get so up in arms about which day, but that rest and worship day needs to be there and should be part of the rhythm of the church's life together. Ultimately, yes, Christ is our eternal rest, but the principle of putting aside one day a week for time together as a family in Christ to rest and worship is still very good and important. And I think that comment, it adds a little bit of flavor text that most of the people listening to our podcast, not all of them, but most of the people listening to our podcast probably have never thought about. In the Western world, and even in most of the non-Western world where the church meets, it's really not a big deal. It's not dangerous. It might be inconvenient. It might get you some sideways glances, but in most of the Western world, meeting together on Sunday morning, if the people around you even notice that you're doing it, they don't really care. They don't persecute you. They're not coming after you. But there are definitely parts of the world where a group of people gathering together on Sunday morning wouldn't just raise eyebrows, it would put targets on those people's back. So we wanted to sort of talk a little bit about, is there I guess number one, is there still a a command or a regulation or a prescription of some sort for the church to continue to meet one day in seven? And is that day what we call Sunday, the Lord's Day? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about what about other situations where that's not feasible or it's not safe or something like that. So Jesse, what say you?
Well, I think, as you know, Reformed theology has often promulgated this idea of like two kinds of Sabbath. Would not, and I always kind of dislike when we try to really overly parse something, but here it might be helpful because of Brother Noah's like original question. God's work of creation established a 7-day cycle. That's very clear. And the Sabbath was a memorial binding upon Adam and the whole human race descending from him. So we have at first, like just from the jump, that the Bible is clearly teaching that that part, this idea of honoring that, the memorialization of God's work, his creation, and then the continuation or the basically him resting on that day is an obligation that's perpetual. So much later on, God's plan was expanded to Israel by Moses. Other uses of the Sabbath principle were imposed upon Israel to prefigure the redemptive work of the Messiah. All that's at play, and that's usually where our minds go. But I think what's important to remember, and I would say in like the first part of that question, is it's probably helpful for us to recognize two kind of separate levels, maybe of the law included in the Sabbath principle at the time of Christ. The first was creation Sabbath, and that's binding perpetually upon all humans since creation. It's commemorative of creation. The second piece, which just gets into this idea of like what day and to what degree, and hasn't Christ set us free and that we rest completely and fully in him? The answer is yes. Yes to creation Sabbath. Yes to the second level, which I would call, or I think theologians call, Levitical Sabbaths, which was binding upon Israel till the fulfillment of Christ. Hence, kind of, you can see that kind of the entry point of Brother Noah's question there. That's like revelatory of redemption. So the answer to both of those is yes and yes, right? It's yes in that we honor it because it's a perpetual obligation of what it signifies. And as we memorialize it, we participate in that while not negating the fact that, yes, of course, Christ is our rest in so many ways, because all of this was, in a way, at least at one level, prefiguring his redemptive plan and purpose for bringing about an eschatological sign and seal that we're about to have the fullness of all the rest. And so we model that in the shadow world, so to speak, by the way in which we entrust God to things, by literally ceasing and stopping, by ceasing and desisting from all of the things that we feel like we need to do to accomplish the stuff that we feel like is ours to accomplish. So I think I'll just stop there and say in the first piece, yes, still in play, all still in play. And then the particulars probably I hold with a little bit more of like an open hand, which I presume is the second part of our conversation.
Yeah. So, I think conversations about the Sabbath are really, really helpful. I think, and I'll just, this is not anything reflective of the listener. Brother Noah's question's great, and we asked for questions, but in other situations, where I see people talking about the Sabbath, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit, and I'm like, why are we still talking about this? Like, it's so over discussed. And in a lot of ways, I think a lot of the common conversations that happen about Sabbath miss the point entirely. And we can get into that. I think you and we've actually done some discussions on like, if your only conversation about the Sabbath is like, can I do X, Y, or Z, or is A, B, or C forbidden? Like, you're actually missing the whole point of the Sabbath, which is that's exactly what Christ said to the Pharisees when they were like, well, you did this on the Sabbath. He's like, look, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which isn't to say like you can do whatever you want as long as it's blessing you. Like that is to say there are still regulations, there's still rules. But if you put the primary focus of the conversation and sort of our reflection on the Sabbath on what we can or can't do, you're totally missing it. But on another level, I think conversations about the Sabbath are really helpful because it sort of shows you and forces you to think about the nature of the law and the nature of the ceremonial law, particularly. So the Sabbath command is interesting because we would affirm that in the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandments are moral law, right? There's moral law, there's ceremonial law, and there's civil law. The moral law is universal. It's built into the fabric of creation. It reflects God's nature. It's unchanging. It's forever in effect. Even following the general resurrection and glorification of the saints, we're still obligated to follow the moral law. We will do so necessarily because of our renewed glorified nature, but those laws are still in effect, right? It's never going to be okay to murder. It's never going to be okay to commit adultery. It's never going to be okay to lie. Those things are universal. What's a little bit unique about the Sabbath command in the Ten Commandments is there's this ceremonial element to it that's kind of attached to it. And so we have to think a little bit about the ceremonial aspects of the Sabbath command in the Ten Commandments in order to understand really like what Reformed theology thinks about when we talk about the Lord's Day being the Christian Sabbath. And so what's helpful, and this actually goes back to some of the things that I've been learning in covenant theology, in Reformed covenant theology, is that most of what the ceremonial law points to, it points forward to, right? So circumcision points forward to the death of Christ and the removal of sin. It points forward to, I suppose not entirely forward, but it points to regeneration. Baptism as the corresponding sign in the new covenant points backwards to the accomplishing of what circumcision pointed forward to, right? So circumcision points forward to the removal of sin by the cutting off of the flesh, which happens to Christ, right? We talked about this in the Colossians series. Christ's circumcision was also his baptism, which we know was his passion and tribulation. Circumcision points forward to that. Baptism points backwards to that. And so both of those signs are pointed at the reality that Christ is and accomplishes for us. The same thing could be said about either Passover or perhaps all of the festivals, all of the feasts. They point forward to what Christ would accomplish and the blessings he would give to his people. And then the Lord's Supper is the corresponding sign in the New Testament, points backwards to what Christ did accomplish and the blessings he has delivered to his people. That sort of like looking forward, looking backwards, centered on the cross, centered on the ministry and the life and death of Jesus Christ, the resurrection, the ascension, the same thing is in effect. The same exact dynamic is in effect with the Sabbath and then the Lord's Day, right? The Sabbath is initially a celebration of the creation of all things, right? It's the rest that God enters into upon his completing of creation. And then it becomes indicative in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy's account of the Ten Commandments, the ceremony element is the redemption of Israel out of Egypt, right? You once were slaves, you've been redeemed out of Egypt. That's why you celebrate the Sabbath. That points forward to the freedom and the recreation that would be ours in Christ in his life and ministry. The reason that this shifts to the Lord's Day, to Sunday, instead of being the seventh day Sabbath, it's now the first day Sabbath because it's pointing backwards to what Christ did. And that's why we celebrate it on the day that he was resurrected. So it's not an arbitrary change. It's not like the church just said, and this maybe gets a little bit at what I might say in response to that second comment we talked about. The church in the first century was just as persecuted as anywhere on earth is now, right? Just as bad, just as much. And it probably put a bigger target on their head, especially in Israel, which is where the first persecutions happened. It put a bigger target on their back that they weren't meeting on the Sabbath. In fact, Jewish Christians met on the Sabbath and on the Lord's Day in order to sort of continue that. So I'm not sure I'm sold on the idea that like we should just I shouldn't say just. I'm not sold on the idea that moving the Lord's Day is a decision we can make sort of unilaterally. We'll get there. I'm not condemning people who out of necessity meet on some other day. But the significance of the seventh or the first day Sabbath, the significance of the Lord's Day Sabbath is not neutral. And so I want to read this out of the confession, or out of the catechisms, just so people don't think I'm making this up. It says, which day, question 59 of the shorter catechism, which day of the seventh hath God appointed to be the weekly Sabbath? It says, from the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ, God appointed the seventh day of the week to be the weekly Sabbath, and the first day of the week ever since to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath. So confessionally, as Reformed Christians, we don't get to say that the Sabbath is whatever day we choose to. I've heard, and I think this is maybe more of like just sort of like a sloppy way to talk, and maybe people don't actually think this. I've heard people, particularly ministers, say like Monday is my Sabbath because I have to work on Sunday. I understand what's being said there. I get it. I get that. Basically, what's being said is a minister doesn't really get to rest on Sunday. They're working. A lot of reform ministers are preaching 2 sermons. There's usually fellowship meals. A lot of days, that's the day that visitation is done because the pastor is already kind of like tied up for the day, and so they're setting up meetings with congregants, and they're people are off work. So I understand that what's being said is my need to rest, to physically cease from my work. I do that on Monday or Tuesday instead of on Sunday when everyone else does it. Um, I think it's a little sloppy to then say that Monday or Tuesday is the Sabbath day, because the Sabbath is more than just like, I'm not going to do any work. I'm going to like hang out on the couch. But before we talk about the other stuff, I did want to sort of ground that in that we don't get to just change the Sabbath day to a different day out of some sort of expediency, whether that's a legitimate expediency or whether it's sort of a lazy expediency. We don't get to just arbitrarily change it. And because that typology, both forward and backwards, is super, super important. And it's very central to how the church has developed its worship throughout the millennia of the church age. So all of that said, though, I do think it's important to talk about sort of this concept that happens in New Covenant theology of like Christ is our rest, so we don't have to actually set aside another day. I'm not sure where that comes from exactly, like biblically, but I can understand the logic apart from not understanding the exegetical foundation. So Jesse, do you have experience? I know you have you had an associate that you were friends with or colleagues with or had some sort of connection with who was really big in kind of New Covenant theology, I think. Do you have experience with this and how kind of that logic and that biblical argument is made?
Well, first, I think you teased us. Weren't you going to read from? Did you read from the confession?
I did. I read the catechism.
I'm in the catechism. Were you reading from the confession as well?
No, I was just going to do the catechism. I'll probably read from the confession later. Jesse it's like you just read what I wanted to read, and Jesse was like, did you even read something?
I thought you were also going to go to the confession. Sorry, I was tracking there, and I thought you were like, I got 2 things for you. So
no, sorry, maybe I did. I got on a little bit.
Yeah.
Of
that was great. Now I'm totally off though, so I'm gonna have to go back to you.
Live podcasting, folks. So, to kind of get at the core of the question that the listener brought, I don't think we can just say that because Christ is our rest, and this gets at what Jesse sort of started off this little segment on. Just because Christ is our rest doesn't mean that there isn't still this principle. And this is where that ceremonial distinction that I just mentioned comes in. The moral law has baked into it that 1 day in 7 is to be set aside for worship, rest, for acts of charity and necessity, for serving the Lord in a sort of heightened fashion, right? We serve the Lord every day. We should be serving the Lord all the time, right? Pray at all times, or pray without ceasing, right? But also there are times that we specifically are praying. That same idea is in effect. This is where maybe I will go back to the catechism here. It says the 4th commandment is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all their work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, right? That comes out of Exodus 20, and then also out of Deuteronomy. It's the same basic phrasing with a little bit of a change there. But the principle of 1 day in 7 being devoted unto the Lord, in acts of service, in acts of worship, in private acts of piety, public religious acts, those kinds of things. And then with works of necessity and works of charity, not contradicting that principle. That 1 in 7 principle is moral law. That's built into the fabric of creation. It reflects God's character, it reflects his nature, and it's a command for all people for all times to set aside 1 day in 7. So the argument that we no longer have to do that because Christ has fulfilled that, this is sort of the sort of flippant response that you see online, but I think it actually holds some rhetorical force, is we wouldn't say that Christ has fulfilled our chastity, right? Christ is our chastity. I think we can say that, right? Any positive holiness that we possess, any righteousness or moral clarity or moral integrity we have is because Christ has imputed it to us and is sanctifying us. So we could say Christ is my honesty, or Christ is my integrity, Christ is my chastity, Christ is my honesty, right? Talking about the ninth commandment. Christ is my worship, like my piety. He's my religious fidelity to God. He's my conformity to God's prescriptive commands in worship, right? You could take all of the commandments, you could make a similar kind of statement. You might have to be creative on how you phrase it, but all of those things Christ fulfills for us and is for us. We wouldn't at the same time make the argument that because Christ is my chastity, that I don't have to be faithful to my wife, right? We wouldn't say that because Christ has fulfilled my sexual purity. He's caused me to be sexually pure and righteous, that I no longer have a commitment or a requirement to obey the seventh commandment in its particularities. And I think that's where this argument goes sideways, is it does pull out that fourth commandment and pulls it out and sort of treats it differently than all of the other commandments. Again, with good reason, because there is this ceremonial aspect to it that is a little bit unique from the others, but it pulls that out and it treats the entire command as though it is utterly different or utterly separate from the other commandments and isn't a category of itself.
That's the stuff. That's it. I mean, maybe I would summarize it this way. The primary focus of the creation Sabbath is ceasing from our labors and remembering the sovereign creatorship of God, to whom all glory belongs, right? So that makes it a perpetual day of worship as long as the created heavens and the earth remain. Therefore, it's moral in its nature, and we ought to do it.
Yeah. And this is a little bit of speculation, maybe. I would actually say there probably will be some level of Sabbath cycle in the new creation too, right? Exactly what that looks like, I don't know. But the fact is that the moral law is not going to expire with this creation. Some of the moral laws may no longer have direct relevance anymore in terms of like, I guess maybe they will, although they will never be violated, right? Just like I said earlier, it's never going to be okay to lie. There might still be contexts in which lying would be possible theoretically, but no one will have a will to do so. Um, I think it's likely, again, this is speculative, so I don't want to be too firm on it. I think it's likely that God still will have a Sabbath cycle of some sort that his people follow. There may still be times where there's a heightened or a focused level of worship or service that is different somehow than the other times. I tend to think that heaven or the new heaven and the new earth will probably look a little bit more like our life now than we think it will, in terms of sort of like the daily cycle and rhythm of things. I don't think we're going to just be in some perpetual, eternal, unending worship service. I think that the new earth is the new earth. And although Revelation is highly symbolic, there's still agriculture. They're still cultivating the land. They're still cultivating the nations that are seen in Revelation. And so even though those are probably symbolic statements, they're still symbolic of something. So I think that talking about the Sabbath, as I said earlier, is a really useful thing, because it causes us to think about and sort of reflect on all of these other different elements and aspects of the law. And it's kind of like a good it's like a good icebreaker question, right? It's not intended to be only the question itself, but it's intended to sort of like open up the conversation on other things. And I think it really does that really effectively.
In other words, God will make all things new, not all new things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So Jesse, let's chat a tiny bit. I know we want to wade into this carefully, because neither of us live in the persecuted church. Neither of us have any fear of reprisal or any sort of like danger when we go to church tomorrow morning. Things happen all over the place, but like there's no reasonable expectation that we're at risk tomorrow when we get dressed and go to church. But I do want to talk a little bit about this comment that came in afterwards, this response to this, because I think it's a really interesting, almost like a case study, or it's almost like the trolley problem for the Sabbath, right? When we're in a situation where the regular prescribed the prescribed meeting day right? The time is a circumstance, but the day of worship, I think, is prescribed to us. When we're in a situation where the prescribed day is not possible or not safe, how should we think about that? Like, what do we do in those scenarios? I guess I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think it's worth thinking a little bit and maybe like reasoning it out together about what we would think about those days and times.
I'm with you. I literally have no answer on this. I'm afraid actually to answer because of a lack of good perspective on this. But
Yeah.
I think where I would land is, I think in being obedient to God and in clinging closely to Jesus Christ, doing what we are to serve Him and to stand for Him and do so with strength, to be guided by the Holy Spirit in proper decision making and wanting to honor the Sabbath, that it seems to me that there might be appropriate liberty. But I don't think I actually have the liberty to give a good answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I might venture out a little bit more than that. Personally, I think, I want to echo what you're saying. Like, I think when we're not in situations, especially situations like this that are significant, right? It's not just that, like, well, I don't live in Minnesota, or I don't live in Iowa, so I can't talk about what Iowa's like. This is deeper than that. It's more substantial than that. So I want to be a little bit trepidatious, but I think that maybe that the way I would think about it, if I was in a circumstance like that, as much as I can extrapolate from my own world, is I might still try to observe some sort of Christian Sabbath on the prescribed day. And maybe that's just a matter of doing that privately with my family in our home, and not necessarily, I guess maybe I would think about a little bit how we did things at our church during COVID, right? We did the best we could with what we had. And so our church personally, and this was really only during the times where there was legal repercussions, like when the state was actually saying you're not allowed to meet, and this was a universal thing for all people. We moved to Zoom, where we would have our gathered worship on Zoom. But we were also very clear in terms of how we communicated that to the congregation and how we thought about it. We were very clear that this was not a substitute for gathered worship, and that for that time period where we weren't able to physically come together on the Lord's Day, we were not meeting for worship in the formal sense. We were not fulfilling the command to gather together on the Lord's Day. But we also didn't go into that feeling guilty or sad or upset about it, because we worked with what we had. God had providentially closed the pulpit for a time. And he also providentially gave us technology at the time that allowed us to still do some of the things and to edify each other, even though we weren't properly technically fulfilling the command that was given to us. We still were making do with what we had. So I think that might be the reasoning personally that I would apply to a situation that's being described. If a group of Christians is wanting to gather together because they see the utility in that, they see the spiritual edification in that, they want to gather and edify the saints, they want to share their spiritual gifts, they want to sit under the teaching of an ordained elder, or whatever, the particular aspect might be. I think it would be reasonable to still do that on a different day, but I personally would be gun shy of calling that our Sabbath gathering, because of all the things that we talked about earlier, that the day of the week is not an arbitrary decision. It's not left entirely to the church's discretion to decide which day of the week is going to be the Sabbath for that church. But also recognizing, like, sometimes it's not a good idea to get together. And sometimes there are safety impediments or reasons why gathering on the Lord's Day is not a feasible thing. And all of those things happen within the constraints and the prescription of God's providence, right? We shouldn't suppose that God is always necessarily commanding and providentially leading a particular group to do what it does, in terms of like, God's prescriptive command, his revealed will, is that churches should meet on Sunday. But providentially, he orders it that in some instances that's not safe or feasible. So I think we should sort of step back with a bit of, and I think Jesse is doing a better job than I am at this point. I think we should step back with a bit of like epistemological humility and say we don't necessarily know what God is intending for this particular group of Christians. And the circumstances of providence should also be used to sort of engage our wisdom as Christians about what we should or shouldn't do. But again, personally, I would be a little bit uncomfortable calling a gathering on a Friday, calling that the Sabbath gathering. But also, like, if that's when those Christians can meet to edify each other and to worship together and to take the Lord's Supper, and there's an elder who's going to administer that, then I say have at it. But again, like, I would try to still do something personally, whether that's a gathering with my family or spending my own devoted time in prayer and reading and meditation. I would still try to do that on the Sabbath if it were me personally.
The follow-up comment in Telegram is a really great one.
Yeah.
And what actually struck me was not necessarily this idea of, does it bring us into a, theological armchair discussion about what day and who has the right to choose and what are the circumstances. But more when I read that, what I thought was, Lord have mercy, that there are places where that is a decision that must be made. And we ought to be, again, just thinking and praying for our brothers and sisters all around the world, for whom not only do they not have the same liberties or freedoms, and that's really just kind of the lowest level we're talking about here, but really meet, and it is the gathering, it is the coming together, that they do so under the threat of their lives. And it's so severe and so serious that they find that there might be a way for them, I think, as you've said, where gathering on Sunday is impossible or dangerous. The spirit of the law, the superintending will of God, rest, worship, remembrance of God's works may actually take precedence over the letter, the specific day, for good reason. That gives us enough pause and concern to really fall on our knees and cry out for God's church everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that should be enough for this topic for now. Again, the Sabbath is a topic that the Reformed world will continually come back to. And so I would not be surprised if although this is the definitive episode on Sabbath,
Right.
I would be surprised if we don't come back to do another definitive episode on Sabbath at some point in the future. We don't want to do that again during this Grab Bag series. So if you have a topic you'd like to talk about, please do go to t.me/Reformed Brotherhood, look for the sub channel for topics, and please share with us something you'd be interested in us talking about. Otherwise, we're going to pick something, and I'm sure we'll have fun talking about it, but you may not care. We want to talk about the things that you care about. So please go check that out. We would love to hear your voice. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And the Telegram chat is just a great place to be. There's lots of good stuff going on. People are praying for each other. People are sharing memes. People are sharing tech advice and talking about, all sorts of cool stuff that's going on. So please do check that out. t.me/Reformed Brotherhood.
So what have we learned on this episode? Well, it seems pretty clear that you ought to be careful when you swing a guitar, what is in its path, because you never know which of those two things is actually going to be the thing that gets destroyed. It also seems that we learned that the Sabbath is necessary because it's not merely, as Tony was saying, ceremonial or Mosaic ordinance, but it's a creation ordinance. It's established by God at creation as part of the moral law for humanity. And that means, as I think we've said before, if it didn't come through, hopefully it does explicitly now, that it's a blessing and not a burden. That the day, of course, is intended for rest, refreshment, spiritual renewal, a time to cease from our labors, enjoy God's provision and presence. And in Christ, as Brother Noah pointed us to, the Sabbath does point to this deeper rest, freedom found in the gospel, where believers rest from their own works and trust in Christ's finished work for salvation.
Yes, Jesse, absolutely. Well, Jesse, thanks for chatting with me about this topic tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for being a little bit more restrained than me. It's always good to be humbled by someone else's wisdom, which is great. I'm happy to do it. But Jesse, until next time, honor everyone.
Love the brotherhood.
What if I'm far from home? Oh, brother, I would hear you call. What if I lose it all? Oh, sister, I would help you out. If the sky comes falling down for you, there's nothing in this world I wouldn't